All right, everyone, we'll get started. Good morning. Thank you for coming here as an early morning session. I heard a few folks as I was walking in, they said, nothing's good until after lunch. So I was like, oh no, are we gonna have an empty room? So I'm glad we don't have an empty room. So I'll start with just personal introductions, and then we'll kind of jump into the origin of today's discussion, understanding the HEARTH Act. And I think we'll just get started. So Buju, Ndinawe Maganuduk, Nikki Paratis, Indigenous Cause, Makwa and Dudem, Onamani, Zagi Gung, and Dunjaba. Hello, all my relatives. I'm Nikki Paratis. I'm Bear Clan from the beautiful Lake Vermilion side of the Boys Fort Reservation here in Minnesota. And I also work at the Center for Indian Country Development at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. So unlike some of you, I didn't have that far to come today, just about a 30-minute drive. And we're going to talk about understanding the HEARTH Act, and we have an esteemed panel here, so you're going to be learning mostly from them. I'm just a facilitator and also here to learn. But one of the reasons we at the center thought about putting together a session on HEARTH, even though we don't know much about it, is because we do a lot of research around economic development in Indian country. And of course, land and land tenure systems are a big part of all parts of Indian country, but certainly economic development. And so one thing that we saw is land systems, right, have been historically made to be pretty difficult in terms of development of business, residential, and agriculture purposes. And so we wanted to learn more about that. And as we learn more about it, we kind of feel like it's almost like an onion. You're like peeling back layers. It's really complex. So all of the work that the land staff professionals do and our conference host, the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, I'm just pretty in awe, because I feel like if I research this for a lifetime, I'd probably only be kind of scratching the surface in terms of its complexity. But one thing I wanted to share is, at the Minneapolis Fed, we do have a lot of economists, and we do work with a lot of economists across the country. And we keep seeing that property rights, in terms of their role in economic development, is kind of a growing field of study in Indian country. So that's something that we are looking at. And we've seen also over the years, there have been a lot of legislative changes that have kind of aimed to improve the ability to lease land on trust land, and to make development really almost as close to fee simple as possible. Feels like that seems to be the goal. We don't always make the mark with those legislative changes, but that seems to be the goal. And these policy interventions over the last several decades, I think, are aimed at reducing federal bureaucratic oversight and delays in processing leases and loan packages. And again, with the ultimate goal being to make lending on trust land as simple and development on trust land as close to fee simple as possible. So at last year's land staff conference, I co-hosted or co-facilitated a session on mortgage lending. And one of the questions that we had asked everyone was, if you could kind of dig into the challenges and the opportunities of making, I guess, lending faster and more accessible in Indian country, especially on trust land, what would be the questions you would ask, and what are the issues? And it was very obvious that day, in a room of about 100 folks and a good number also tribal leaders, that there was a lot of interest in the potential of the HEARTH Act, right, to expedite leasing and to make economic development more possible. But what was also pretty evident that day was that there still was a lot of information that people didn't have about its application, about its costs, about its benefits. So that kind of leads us here today. That's a pretty long windup, but we have tribes that have implemented HEARTH with us today from the Ho-Chunk Nation, from Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and also from the Makah Nation. So we have a good geographic diversity, and they're gonna be here to really answer those questions, right? What are the potential benefits? What are the costs? and what are some of the challenges. So I think we hope for this to be very interactive today. And so if you have questions just as we go, please feel free to shout them out. For those that were here a little bit earlier, I also said as a kind of programming note, the session is being recorded, but I don't believe you'll be spotlighted, so don't feel shy. And I think because I'd, again, be the only one running the mic, you don't want to see me trip, and I'm also really slow, just shout the question out and we'll make sure to repeat it into the mic. So I think without kind of further ado, before I get into kind of what is always the question I get after a session when I don't explain it up front, what is the Fed? Why do they care about Indian country? I think I'd like the panelists to maybe give a brief introduction, and then we'll continue on. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Matthew Curiaga. I'm with the Ho-Chunk Nation Realty Division. Before I was with the Realty Division, I was a lease specialist for about 3 years.
I'm Charles Malloy. I've been with the Citizen Potawatomi Nation for about 17 years. I have about a 45-year professional career in providing planning and management services both to Indian tribes and to small communities scattered all over central Oklahoma. As I'm kind of looking at the tail end of my career, I ran into Rocky Barrett, who's our chairman, a second time in my career. And he convinced me that I needed to come over and work with him a while. And I thought, well, this is probably good for 18 months anyway. Well, 17 years later, I'm still there and still going. So.
Hi, my name is Dale Denny. I'm the McCaw Realty Officer. I've been working with Realty for 24 years now, and been making sure that we did get the HEARTH Act so it would be easier for us to do our leases for the tribal land.
And I think just as, in case more people filter in, I don't want it to look like there's like someone taking this spot. So I'm just gonna move it. I don't drink coffee, so this is my alternative, but if I seem low energy, it's because I obviously didn't drink any caffeine yet today. So no, thank you for your introductions, and kind of before I get back into just a quick overview of the Center for Indian Country Development, just a quick question. How many, we were asking this question ahead of time, I wonder how many people in the room are pretty familiar with HEARTH, like what it's intended to do, kind of its programmatic aspects. How many feel like they would be, will do beginner, intermediate, and advanced? How many do you think are beginners? And intermediate, thank you, and then could almost lead a panel session themselves. That would definitely not be me. I think maybe I would still classify myself as a beginner. So I'll just briefly state, you can see the mission of the Center for Indian Country Development on the slide deck, but we're pretty new at the Minneapolis Fed, and we were launched back in 2015. And though we're based in Minneapolis, we actually do have a national scope. And the Fed itself, I won't go into its dual mandate around monetary policy and setting maximum employment, but among those functions is a community development function, and that's where the Center for Indian Country Development comes in. And they have a long history of research around like education, business, and entrepreneurship. Goes back at least 20 years, so they really are building on kind of that legacy of working in Indian country and really understanding that this needs to be stood up in a big way. So they launched the center, and our mission is pretty broad and audacious. It's centered on research and also convenings and collaborations and engaging with tribes and lenders and their partners. But again, it's really centered on just supporting what we hear is important. So what are the top issues in Indian country? And basically, we serve as an ear for, this is kind of what we would like you to do. This is where there's gaps in data and where there might be gaps in kind of national awareness. So that's, at a broad glance, the role that we play. I won't go into so much our areas of research, because those are also pretty broad, but they do center on people, land, and capital. And of course, as we talk about the HEARTH Act, which I realize I didn't give a definition for yet, and I might pass that to Matt to do, unless somebody else wants to take an attempt. I do know the definition at the very least. But as we get into the HEARTH Act and looking at how to make leasing faster and more enticing for lenders to an Indian country, that certainly touches land, and it certainly touches access to capital. And I think we all know in this room, access to capital is a challenge in Indian country on trust land, and HEARTH has some major potential there. So overview of, I guess, our next little less than an hour and a half will be just a brief overview of the history, what HEARTH is intended to do, where it came from, costs and benefits, challenges and implementation. So again, I'm just here giving, kind of setting the stage, and so I'll quit talking fairly soon. And before I go on to the next thing, I might ask two people to share, maybe three. What are you hoping to get out of the session? Is this slide hopefully addressing why you're interested in being here?
I'm here because the housing on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation is falling apart.
So housing in Pine Ridge falling apart needs a solution, which is something we hear very endemic and a shared experience across Indian country.
Everyone acknowledges it, but no one seems to be doing anything.
And we will talk about that. Yeah, what's being done? What's being done? Even on Pine Ridge, I do know. I won't go too far down another tangent, but we do know some efforts to build tiny homes to try to facilitate lending, and also work through even the CDFIs that are there and the credit union to hopefully get mortgage lending and have them become HUD 184 lenders. That is a good question, actually. Since that's a question right now, is development construction part of HEARTH, like rehabilitation?
To me, HEARTH is just specific to the lease itself. Once you have the lease in place, whether it's for a individual tribal member or your designated housing entity, I mean, it helps gets the lease faster, which gets you a certified TSR faster, which gets you the your funds faster. But I'm not sure it's the end all be all for your problem there.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Good question. Come on in, and this row's not taken, most of this row. So I saw another hand up, I think over in the corner. Yes? Suquamish? Until just recently. So she was saying, was it Lindsay? Leslie, sorry. Leslie from Suquamish in Washington was saying, looking to push through residential leases faster because it can take a very lengthy amount of time when they are processed through the BIA, which is the status quo, right? If you don't compact the land, title, and records functions or implement HEARTH. In my case, just talking about my own personal mortgage on trust land here again on my reservation in Minnesota, it took almost 2 years due to this lengthy kind of processing time. So it is definitely an inhibitor for development, but for all types of development. So The HEARTH Act, though I didn't give the definition, I was trying to bucket off to Matt, is essentially kind of bypassing that process, Leslie, through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which, again, the status quo requires their approval on every lease, and also for the title status reports and other mortgage documents. But it's meant, the HEARTH Act is meant to do like a pre-approval. So it's that process itself and implementation, which you'll hear more about, can be long and arduous in some respects. But once you go through that implementation, then the tribe is able to issue its own leases, after it implements the leasing regulations and after they're approved. So that's an important, I think, benefit.
My name's Tom Swanson from Fairbank, Potawatomi, but it took the BIA 2 years to approve our HEARTH Act. So what I'd like to do for the tribe who have the HEARTH Act here and implemented it, what the success stories are that they have.
Yes, and you got 3 of them here, and I promise I'll quit talking soon so we can hear from them. But yeah, he was saying he'd like to hear more about the success stories because in their case, was it Prairie Potawatomi? Took 2 years to go through the process. Quick question from our panelists. In each of your experiences, how long, just in a nutshell, how long was the process itself? Just in terms of time.
From beginning on our end, internally we were talking about it with the Ho-Chunk Nation, and it took us about, I want to say like 4 or 5 months to draft the actual code. There was revisions internally through our development committee and at our full legislature, and also our code had to go out for a 45-day public comment. So us on our end, it was about 4 or 5 months, but when we sent it to the feds for approval, it took approximately a year and 2 or 3 months, give or take, and that was just, there was a lot of back and forth between us and the solicitor's office on the certain language. I'm guessing you guys probably went through that too. They wanted certain language changed, and there was some processes they were kind of questioning. And when we got the final draft that we wanted, we had to bring that back to the nation and again send that out for another public comment for, so every code that we send out and try to get approved, we get public comment on. So we had to, since it was a new language introduced, that was sent out again for a 45-day review. We sent that back, and about a month after that, we got our final stamp of approval from the Interior.
We got into the program early on, and a little bit later I'll talk about some of the things that kind of led the tribe into this. The HEARTH Act kind of became retro rockets for our economic development programs. But when the HEARTH Act came out and we made the decision, let's go do this, and that took a little while. We had to look at it. But once the decision was made to start the process, we got through it in about 2 months. Now, we were the 6th tribe to get their regulations approved by the Secretary.
When we started the HEARTH Act, I got a hold of our tribal attorneys in February of 2015, and then we got it all sent into Interior and went back and forth, and our final approval was August 18, 2015, so it wasn't a very long process.
And just a quick follow-up. When was I guess your implementation? When was that finalized? Like what year? Yeah, when did they finally approve it? That's more the question. Yeah. This past year. So he was saying that he's a pretty recent adopter of HEARTH, and I will say that sounds like a really long time, right, to go through that process, 2 years. I do know, and we'll get into this again, so as a foreshadow, some of the challenges or limitations. We've heard from some of our kind of partners that the BIA in its initial, right, kind of launch of HEARTH had really good training and resources and had staff appointed really just to work in this area and also to process and to do the recordings when they were coming in and to go through the approval process, they actually had dedicated staff. I don't know, so I wouldn't quote me on this, though I know I'm being recorded, and that's okay. But we've heard that they don't necessarily have the same resources that they did in 2012 or 2013 or even 2015 when Dale and McCaw got the approval for their leasing regs. So that might be one explanation for kind of your experience. So I want to say maybe we'll kind of move on to the next session, but or section, I should say, not the next session. Don't go anywhere. Like I said, I was going to do a bigger kind of wind-up or explanation of why HEARTH is important and its potential. I'll try to keep it brief. The slide that you're looking at here shows some of the research that the CICD has done to look at, this is depicting mortgage lending. So HUD 184 lending on fee land and on trust land. And is everyone pretty familiar with the HUD 184 program? Just by show of hands. So pretty familiar. It's kind of the premier loan product. It was launched over 20 years ago, maybe almost 30 years ago, or actually, 30 years ago now. It just reminds me of how old I am, so I don't like to think that that was 30 years ago. But it was launched to really make mortgage lending easier and faster on trust land. So it was launched with trust land as its focus. And can someone tell me what happens here around 2003? See that trend line, the red trend line? What do you think happens in 2003? Opened up to fee land. Yeah, I think I heard a couple people say that, someone in the audience and Matt. So when it was opened up to fee land, you can see that red line take rate off, right? And so part of the research that we've done shows that over 90% of HUD 184 mortgage lending in Indian country is on fee land, not trust land. So a lot of, I think they have over $1 billion in their budget, and that is largely bypassing Indian country, because 60 million acres of Indian country is still trust land. So that's pretty significant, right? And that's definitely a lost opportunity for residential development. And one thing we talk about a lot at the Fed is the importance of housing and the importance of homeownership and economic development at large. So it's a driver, right, for business growth, job growth, and just community well-being. Because homeownership also produces better outcomes for our youth in terms of health and education. So it's a big lost opportunity. And when we have drilled down to find out why this picture looks like this, one big explanation is how difficult it is to go through the leasing and titling process through the Secretary of the Interior. And so we're here today because if we can expedite these leases and make the lending process faster, we're really unlocking the potential for not just the homeownership development, which brought the CICD into this space, but really for all development. And then I believe this is the last slide or so, but as we looked at that previous chart on HUD 184 lending, we also looked at kind of what lending looks like by tribe and by reservation area for trust land lending. And one thing that we saw is though even though 10% of the total lending, only 10% I should say is happening on trust land, there are tribes that are doing pretty high volume and high percentages of loans on trust. So this x-axis says number total loans, HUD 184 loans, and then the y-axis is the percentage on trust land. So this red box here kind of indicates what we call like the sweet spot. These tribes are doing a high number of HUD 184 loans, and they're doing a really high percentage on trust land. And so, again, part of what the CICD does is we use research, And then we look at things like this and say, well, something is happening in these communities. We want to learn more about it. Let's connect with them and find out. And in every single case, it's about self-governance and institution building. In a good number of these cases, it's communities that have either compacted the land title and records function or they've adopted HEARTH. So if you see the case of like Flathead here, right at the end of this kind of distribution, that's the Confederated Tribes of Salish and Kootenai, and they have compacted the LTRO function. And I have a session tomorrow at 10:30, home ownership in Indian Country, where George Ducharme will kind of get into that a little bit more. So HEARTH and compacting those BIA functions. It's part of the success. So I think we might have talked about this a little bit, but I think I'll turn over maybe to the panel. I'll leave the slide up. This is like the promise of HEARTH, right? What HEARTH is intended to do. But I think I'll ask maybe to go down the line. When you were kind of starting and your tribe was thinking about, implementing HEARTH just in the very early days, what were your kind of hopes and expectations for what it would do?
I think early on, there was an update to the CFR 162, right a couple years before they passed HEARTH. So we had to update our leasing, and I think one of the audience members talked about it was you have to update your lease form so you can be in compliance with that regulation. There was additional language that they required within the lease and within the resolution you were passing. There were certain provisions you had to explain within your resolution if you wanted, if you wanted fair market value, or if you wanted annual rent, or if you wanted adjustments to that rent. All that was found in 162. So we went to the BIA Great Lakes Agency, and we had to update our leases and our resolutions to that. So we kind of had an understanding on what the update was about. And then when HEARTH came about, it was like, oh, well, everything we just went through and all these deadlines that the BIA was trying to implement, we no longer have to abide by if we go move forward with our own leasing regulations. So we still have members that are doing Section 184s on our properties. We don't have a huge land base. Ho-Chunk Nation, we don't have a reservation like many other tribes. We're pretty scattered out. We're in 3 different states and 27 different counties. So there is residential land lots that we do lease out to tribal members. And we also have our own internal home ownership program, but the Section 184 program really took off because they didn't have the cap limit that the other program did. And at the time, we were just looking to see how we can cut as much paperwork and as much administrative time lapse that we can to get these members in their home as fast as we can. Because they had the funding, they were pre-approved. All they were waiting to build and break ground was a piece of paper saying that they can, and the tribe had already passed a resolution allowing the individual to utilize the lot for residential purposes. But because of this 162, we were required to send it up to the BIA. The superintendent was supposed to look at it. A realty officer was supposed to recommend approval. You had NEPA with the environmental aspects of everything. So just explaining that as a leasing specialist to our leadership, they kind of understood why aren't these individuals breaking ground, or they're approved for funding, what's taking so long? Well, it takes almost a year plus to get a lease approved, and that's just this only applies to tribal trust land. I don't know if we made that clear. This doesn't apply to allotment properties or fee properties. This is strictly 100% tribally owned trust properties. So I think after looking at that, we looked at some of the language in the HEARTH, and we decided to move forward with that.
In the non-Indian world, almost all development, that's a generalization, much of the development is financed by mortgaging the land. Of course, the development people have to bring in something to the table also, typically around 20%. but the majority of the funding for the development is through the mortgages on the land and then ultimately mortgages on the buildings that are constructed on the land. In Indian country, on tribal trust land, we've been denied that funding access. So every time that we wanted to develop an enterprise, we had to pay cash up front to make it work. The HEARTH Act makes us look more like what's happening in the non-Indian country or on fee land. It gives us the ability to put a leasehold mortgage on that land, and we have then those funds to use in the development process. So that is probably, as far as we're concerned, and we're only using HEARTH Act for economic and industrial development. We're not into the housing side at all. But that has been a big leap forward for us.
We started with housing in the Sail River Heights. They had a master lease for 77 units, and before we had the HEARTH Act, we had to send it all. We didn't have a trust officer. We're a compacted tribe, so all of our leases and everything had to go to the Northwest Regional Office for approval from the regional director. And it took a lot of time sometimes because, they're in Oregon, we're in Washington, and we're a very remote reservation. So when we got the HEARTH Act approved, it took just going to council resolution, having the chairman sign, and it made it a lot easier for them to get their mortgages and a lot faster. We do use it for, we have a lot of tribal land, and we have a tower that we do a lot of leases for, like T-Mobile and emergency response people from Canada and Washington State and the county, so that we can do those leases way faster than having to send it all the way to Portland and wait for the regional director to sign it or his assistant. So it has helped us a lot, and it makes it go faster.
Yeah, thank you. And I think they described again kind of what the hopes are. And then at the end of the session, I might ask, like, did it fulfill all your wildest hopes and dreams? But one thing I was thinking about when Dale was speaking is what we've heard is there's like 80 plus, right, BIA offices around the country that do processing. And we've heard that there's like almost 80 plus experiences. So there are some that are very fast. And there are some that can take years, like again, which was my experience, took 2 years. But even where you're located, Dale, that Portland office, we hear like glowing reviews about how fast and responsive they are. And even at the CICD, and when we kind of host our calls around these types of issues, they're very engaged and thinking about how can we be part of this like solution from the federal agency side. But even then, doing it in-house is faster, right? So even in the best case scenario, it's still faster. I thought, I'm not probably, again, the one to give a whole history of HEARTH, but one thing I thought that was interesting, if others didn't know, is that it really grew out of, I think, the Navajo example. So almost 15, 16 years ago now, they were looking from the Secretary of Interior for a lease exception. And so I think it took maybe a couple years, they were able to get that lease exception. And then there was kind of mobilization of support for, this kind of authority that Navajo has in their leasing should be granted to all federally recognized tribes. So it took a number of years, but yeah, in 2012, it was passed. And something, just as a side note, the CICD is interested in looking at with some of our partners is, well, what does the delay, or what do the processing times look like under the BIA, and what do the processing times look like under HEARTH? And we want to do like a statistical analysis to help identify some of the economic benefits, but then also to really dig in, are there some characteristics of tribes that have adopted Hearth, because there's, I think, less than 50, right? And if there's 573 recognized tribes, that's less than 1%, right, of adopted Hearth. So what's unique about that 1%, or panelists here, so you can maybe think about that. I might come back and ask you that. But that is something that we're looking to do kind of on a econometric scale. But since Hearth was only enacted in 2012, our in-house economist said it's hard to really do that type of a study only like a few years later. So I will say, I guess, stay tuned, and that will be coming out. But yes, so I think I'll move on to the next slide. And we're going to pass the mic back to you, Matt. And I know you've already kind of covered kind of some of the experiences you've had at Ho-Chunk Nation, what was, some of your impetus for implementing Hearth. But if you can't see behind you, I have a slide that has an example, because Ho-Chunk is also fairly rare, even though there's less than 1%, right, of all tribes that have enacted Hearth or adopted Hearth leasing regulations. Only 3 of them, to my knowledge, have adopted all 3. So you could choose leasing regulations for residential, for agricultural, or commercial leasing. And Ho-Chunk has done all 3. So I tried to include an example of all 3, which I'll let Matt kind of speak to. But I was in particular interested in, part of that decision or calculus behind, let's do all 3 at once. And maybe you can describe a little bit about your experiencing doing all 3 at once.
Well, yeah, we did submit 3 codes for review, so that might have been the reason it took us so long to get approved. But our land uses on our properties, we are, like I said, a pretty scattered tribe. We got people and villages all over west central Wisconsin, also Wittenberg, and I can go on and on of all the properties and villages we have, but there are some communities and land uses that call for agricultural farming type land use. But I think most importantly, when our government came to be, the homelessness problem was one of the first things they wanted to address. And that was looking at our initial properties that the nation had. A lot of those were for residential uses. So to me, at least from my perspective, getting our Ho-Chunk members in homes, that was always the first and most important part of what the government did for our people. But we also did have business and agricultural land uses on the properties. So instead of just going after one, residential one, we decided why not just move forward with all of them. We do leases on all of them. For ag, that we do lease out some properties to farmers. Or Organic Valley is one of them that leases down at our property down at Kickapoo Valley Reserve. And they're one of our, not so much long-term leases, but it's not such an annual lease for them. It's 5 or 6 years at a time intervals. So it was just I don't know, kind of common sense. Like, let's just tackle them all. In the case of the business, we don't usually have a lot of economic development on our properties other than our own enterprises. But if we were to ever want to open that up for outside leasing, commercial business, or additional lands would go into trust that would enable those type of developments, we have that business code in place, so we wouldn't have to send that to the BIA for approval.
We're still sticking with you because I'm going to have each of your examples, because I don't know that Charles will want to or speak as much to the kind of different examples. But as you were talking about kind of the initial impetus was like, we really want to get Ho-Chunk members into homes. I was looking at, because Matt, I was joking before the session started, is becoming a spokesperson for Hearth with the Minneapolis Fed. We were actually here, I think in the ballroom though, back in July, and we had, the CICD had hosted, along with the Department of the Interior, this kind of day-long session on leasing and titling issues. So Matt spoke, and he actually is a case study in the Tribal Leaders Handbook on Homeownership. So it's basically an overview, kind of comprehensive guide of mortgage lending in Indian country, but really trying to get our minds around understanding like how you navigate the land issues. So I just said that as an aside, but I saw that in that case study, 75% of your current rate leases are residential. And I'm wondering, as you kind of move forward, you were saying there's opportunities. Do you see maybe that changing, like more ag, more commercial, maybe in the future?
Oh, like I said, our land base isn't very large. We don't have a very large land base. Most of our properties are scattered. They're not contiguous to each other. So the feed of trust process poses its own roadblock. But it really depends on which route our leaders want to take, if that's a route they want to take, where they want to invest and have businesses come onto tribal property and lease that, outside entities come and lease. That's something that we have a mechanism that would allow that process to be a lot quicker. But for these cases, the top right, that was a business lease we did with a tribal member out in Tomah, Wisconsin. He runs a jiu-jitsu team, gym on one of our trust properties. That's Organic Valley. I talked about them. The bottom left is HHCDA. That was a veterans supportive housing that we have in our Sand Pillow Village out in Jackson County. And they provide kind of like a single family, I wouldn't say family, but single residence for veterans. So, and all these were hearth leases, so they were done under our own code. We didn't have to go to the BIA. We didn't have to ask permission to do this on our property, essentially, which 162 requires you to do. So there you go.
Yeah. No, thank you, Matt. And I think, and also looking at what you're averaging in terms of the turnaround time. So a lot, like when Charles was talking about the mortgaging land, otherwise can take 30 to 45 days. On fee land, right, those are the standards we're all used to. And then on trust land, we've already talked about it can take years. But for Ho-Chunk, they're also able to meet that industry standard of like 30 days, I think I saw was your average. So that is pretty impressive. And I've driven by that business in Tomah. So I didn't know it was a hearth business. And so now that's pretty cool. But yeah, before we go to the Citizen Potawatomi example, did anyone have like any questions for Matt? Yes.
When you said you had to redo all your forms for your leases, did you also have to go back on leases you already had in place and redo those leases, or leases that are already in place can stay the way they are?
And Matt, if you could just repeat the question.
I believe the question was when we had our hearth enacted, did we have to go back and get those leases reapproved, or were they approved still under the old code? Was that the question? Okay. Well, whenever the leases were passed, they're still in effect for when they were, what law it was approved under. So the ones that were approved under 162, even before 162 was updated, those are still approved under that code. There was a period of 2 or 3 years where we approved after 162 was updated, but pre-hearth. Those are still under that law. And post-hearth, all of our leases on tribal trusts are hearth. But we encourage tribal members, we let them know, with our hearth, we can extend it out for 75 years for residential, a term of 75 years, whereas the BIA only allows for a 25 plus 25 year. That's the max amount. So we just let tribal members know, do you want to come in and update? That gives us also a time to update designation of beneficiary forms, if they have a last will and testament, that they would like to file with us. So that usually gives us a chance to, make sure the lessee's engaged, estate planning. So you don't necessarily have to, but you can go back and get those old leases canceled under 162, especially when, I'd say look at your leases, especially those ones that were approved in like the 70s for your designated housing entities. In the mid to late 80s, because those are coming to expire right now, because those were 50-year terms. So if you're already looking at expiring leases, You can look towards either canceling that lease because it's about to expire or getting a new lease implemented as that lease expires. I know with our designated housing entity, HHCDA, a lot of their leases are expiring. So we want to get their leases under our HEARTH leasing regs. So I think it's something to encourage just because it shows, how many leases you can approve under HEARTH and get those under your current law.
Yeah, that's a good question, and thank you, Matt. One other thing before maybe we kind of pass the mic to Charles soon, is I saw also in the example that Ho-Chunk received in terms of like kind of the implementation, like BIA funding and training. Is that right? Or am I maybe misreading something? Because that is another big question, and it's kind of a foreshadow to talking about some of the challenges, which is the funding and the resources up front. So could you speak to that a little bit?
That was separate from HEARTH. We contracted realty functions 162 from BIA, and under that contract, that enabled us to get access to the BIA's TAM system, which I would encourage all tribes to gain access to. It's the federal government and the Bureau's land data system that has all of your trust land information on it, even the allottees that are under jurisdiction. It has all that ownership, legal descriptions, encumbrances, anything that's been recorded and approved by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It's going to be on that TSR, on that TAM system. So it wasn't exactly connected to HEARTH, but I'd say I'd encourage any tribe out there that does not have TAM's access to talk to your agency or reach out to your regional director and ask about getting access to that system. We do have computers at our offices. We're located about almost 4 hours away from our agency. So we're not one of those tribes that can walk across the street and talk to the BIA. But they're very helpful with access because just having offsite access does create its own problems and issues. But I can tell you, as a TAMS user for a number of years, I've been on TAMS for about 5 or 6 years. It's worth it. It's worth getting that access and understanding how your property is encumbered, what the BIA sees. You're out there on your property, so you understand what's your property. But everything that's on your property, the BIA might not have recorded. There might be leases or encumbrances that weren't recorded with the BIA, and vice versa. So there's a lot to learn. So it wasn't exactly connected to HEARTH, but it was something that we pursued during our pursuit of HEARTH.
That's a helpful distinction for me, because when I read that, I was like, really? That's amazing. And hearing about kind of the TAM system, we've also heard, right, probably enough cases that would take the rest of the session about how those legal descriptions, some of the discrepancies in the recordings can happen. So again, like Matt said, if you're able to have ownership and see that on the tribe's end, that's also a way to kind of circumvent a lot of later issues, whether you adopt HEARTH or not. So no, thank you, Matt. I wanted to kind of switch it over soon to Citizen Potawatomi in Oklahoma, and they are one of, again, the early HEARTH adopters in 2013 for commercial leasing. And the bottom left-hand corner, I was telling Charles this morning, I actually got to visit this gun range, and I think it's one of the first HEARTH businesses. Was it the first for your nation? Yes, okay. And I got to visit this gun range, which is actually owned by Jack Barrett, who's Chairman Rocky Barrett's son. And so I was there with a lot of Fed folks and also kind of presidents of some of these Native-owned banks. So it was like a pretty professional crowd shooting off these guns, and some of them, I don't know the names of them, but it was just a very surreal scene for me. So I remember that distinctly, but I was telling Charles also this morning what I remembered besides testing out guns that were like taller and heavier than me, was his chairman trying to tell us about kind of what the Center for Indian Country Development should be thinking about in the upcoming years around economic development. So there's a host of issues, right, around economic development. We do look at access to capital issues, mortgage lending, supporting Native-owned businesses and financial institutions. There's this whole ecosystem around economic development, and he said, in that huge, vast ecosystem, you really need to be thinking about Hearth and how to expedite leases on trust land, because he said, I think that's kind of the real gem and potential for development going forward for tribes. So I remember him saying that, and then about a year later, we're here doing this, so we're definitely taking it seriously, and the center will also be doing, like I said, a deeper dive into Hearth and other land tenure systems. But I thought maybe now, Charles, I'll pass the mic to you, and I think I'm also interested in learning kind of the initial learning curve. Like, what did it take? Was your staff ready? And if the learning curve was almost vertical, what resources were there for training and kind of the administration of this process?
Wow, did we really do all that?
They like fried bread tacos.
When I went to work for the tribe 17 years ago, Rocky Barrett was very aggressive in setting out his objectives for the tribe, and basically economic development was his primary number one objective. I heard him make the statement in many speeches that at that current time, 17 years ago, 90% of their disposable income came from white man's vices, from gambling and tobacco, and only 10% came from our own tribal enterprises. His goal was to change that percentage such that only 45% of the disposable income came from white man's vices, and 55% came from our own tribal enterprises. I cannot tell you what the ratio is today, but I assure you it has shifted dramatically. Before I started with the tribe, of course, Rocky is a brilliant forward thinker, and he was putting things in place that would, many years later, would advance our development in major strides. For one thing, they bought a bank that was going out of business. And then in addition to that, they were able to expand that bank to the point now where we actually have 6 or 7 banks, and I heard through the rumor mill that we were actually looking at another one. The other thing that he did back in the 2002 was create a CDFI, Community Development Financial Institution, when that came out for tribes. And then about that same time, the Treasury came out with Community Development Corporation. So we put all of those in place. And then as we developed our tribal enterprises, Rocky had some rules that he enforced rigorously as we looked at investing, and this time we're investing our cash into enterprises. Number one, any new enterprise had to either be vertically or horizontally integrated into our existing economic system. That any enterprise we put in place either had to buy from or sell to one of our existing enterprises, so it would have that base of support there to help it going on. The other statement that he made frequently is don't eat the seed corn, which means that we do not do per capita payments. We take the profit from those enterprises and we give it back to the tribal members through our various social programs and education programs and housing programs, but there are no direct cash payments. And he has argued that, and again, I've heard him make that statement many times. The other thing that we have done, we have worked to create an economic milieu in which people want to come in and invest in, or outsiders come in and invest in and put enterprises in the development that we have. You have seen shopping centers where a shopping center will start to go in, and then you have the outlots and you have the fast foods that come in and so forth. We're operating kind of along that line, but we're very careful about the types of businesses we allow in. We wouldn't want to put a slaughterhouse next to McDonald's. that just didn't going to work very well. So we've been careful about that. Then HEARTH Act came along, and this was a real boon for us. Now, HEARTH Act works a little differently than many of the federal programs that we deal with. On many of the BIA programs, everything is set out for you step by step, and you have a check sheet, and you go down the checklist, and you get the piece of paper, and you make sure it says what the program requires. You check it off the list, and you go to the next step. And you just work down. When you get to the 23rd step, you're done, you submit it, you've got a deal. HEARTH doesn't work like that. HEARTH is a blank slate for economic development. When you get your regulations in place and you're ready to start doing business, you have a myriad of alternatives that you can deal with. So as you enter into your HEARTH Act deals, you have to be working with someone who recognizes that even this is going to be a joint partnership and we're going to have to work through it together. And in this case, in our first one, BDC Gunroom, the chairman's son, and he understood this, and we worked together really well in putting together the deal. Now, some of the alternatives that you can look at in putting together your deal, and this is what makes HEARTH Act work so well. You can do, and we follow this one. We like the build to suit. If you're an outside operator, if you have a good idea, if your idea fits what we want to do, fits in our economic milieu, then we will build you a building that suits your needs. We're also careful in the design of that building that if you don't make it, we can put something else in that building. All right, so we don't cater to a McDonald's that has the golden arches, because that's a little difficult to convert to something else. All right, so if we do a build-to-suit deal, then we wind up taking money out of it with, number one, the land lease payment. We take cash out of it as a part of the loan payment because we borrow the money to build the building. We charge sales tax, so we take money out of the business in the form of sales tax, and that sales tax goes to our tax commission, and we take a share of the profits. So those are the things that we would do. Now, the options that we have, you can have the tribe as the owner-operator of a business. We can bring in an outside party, and the tribe is the owner, but the outside person is the operator. Or we can bring in the tribe, or we can do the tribe as the owner and the tribe as the operator. And we have done all three of these. Again, it's a matter of, and it's very flexible, how you want to put your deal together. And that's the beauty of the Act. Our specific projects, our first project was BDC Gunroom. I happened to be very active, or I was very active in competitive shooting, and I was just jumping up and down waiting to get that facility open so that we could start doing it. And as soon as we did get it, this has nothing to do with HEARTH, but as soon as we got it open, I put in a noon league for employees and set it up such that employees could come over, participate in a shooting competition, and be back at their workstation in less than an hour. But that had nothing to do with HEARTH, but it had a lot to do with me, and I enjoyed that part of it. That was a build to suit, and it was an outside party owner operator. And then, as the flexibility under the Act allows, ultimately, he brought in another partner who was in the lawnmower and outside services business, and ultimately the owner bought him out. But again, this was very flexible under the HEARTH Act. Some of the other businesses that show up there, the arena, we built the arena, and then we went in and did a refi under the HEARTH Act so we could take some cash out of it. Same thing with the fry bed taco, and we have a pizza parlor. We do have a land-based operation that, well, we haven't put anything on it yet, but we bought a 300-acre tract. When we bought it in fee, but when we drafted all of the leases and so forth that we're going to operate in that, I made sure that those lease documents looked like a HEARTH Act lease, so that when that land ultimately went into trust, basically the lease documents were already there. All we had to do was update it. So anyway, that's kind of some of our success stories, and HEARTH Act has just, like I said earlier, that made retro rockets for our economic development program. The other thing, and I will second Matt's comment about TAMs, early on, before any tribes had access to TAMs, I started pushing for that, and it took 6 years to get there, and I wanted to make sure Citizen Potawatomi Nation was the first tribe in the nation to have access to TAMs. I didn't make it. Morongo got there first. We were second.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Yeah, question.
Charles, you said you got the tribal sales tax? Yes. Do you have to pay a state sales tax?
So the question was whether, yeah, they had to pay a state sales tax, and Charles said no.
We put in, if you've ever been to our tribal area, and I understand you're Prairie Band, you may have been there. We have that huge, beautiful grocery store. When we were building that grocery store, we started getting a lot of criticism from the community and other grocery store operators in the community, and they say, well, that's unfair because you don't have to pay state sales tax, you're on trust land, and that you have an unfair advantage. And so I don't know exactly the timing on this, but the tribe instituted their own sales tax, and the sales tax is exactly the same amount as if you bought an item in the grocery store from another store other than a tribal store. And that sales tax goes to our tax commission.
Was that an agreement with the state, or you had to ask for anything?
Well, we don't ask. It's on trust. If it's on trust land, and we don't ask, we just do it. When we got into liquor sales, some other deals had to be worked out there with the state because they did try to come back, and although they couldn't prohibit us from selling liquor, they could stop the distributors from selling to us. So in the compacts with the state, and I wasn't involved in that, and I don't want to be, but that got worked out as far as liquor sales. But as on sales tax, we did get sued, and were ultimately successful. We won.
That's a good question. I think we have another one, yep, kind of in the center. Oh, she was just saying that's, yeah, agree, yeah, in agreement. You got solidarity in the ridiculousness of that. Were there any other questions for Charles? Yeah.
I'm curious about your development of like the shopping centers and your construction company that you have internally. How did you develop that expertise like early on to be able to build-to-suit projects?
Yeah. Did you hear that, Charles? Okay, could you just repeat it?
I understand the question to be you were asking how we develop the expertise to be able to construct our projects. Is that the question? Yes. All right. Well, first of all, we have 32,000 tribal members scattered across the world, and about 4,000 to 5,000 of them live locally. And whenever we need expertise in some area, we go out to our tribal members, and we try to find someone who has that expertise. And I wasn't with the tribe very long, and we hired a gentleman who had spent an entire career in superintending construction projects. So as we built our grand casino, we brought him in to superintend that project, and then he oversees most of our other construction projects.
So again, it sounds like in both Ho-Chunk and CPN's case, right, there's a lot of capacity building around the systems that support the leasing that that ideally are also in place, so it's more effective. Had another question here.
Yeah, Charles, you said you were charging sales tax for the grocery store and your liquor store. You were charging sales tax at the liquor store and the grocery store? If you got sued, was that for the grocery store and liquor store, or just liquor store? Just the grocery store.
The basis of the lawsuit, it was. All right, they sued us on our sales tax for the grocery store. And the basis of the suit, it was the city of Shawnee who sued us, and their claim was that any non-Indian who purchased a taxable item in our grocery store, that we should remit that tax back to the city. And that argument fought back and forth for several years, and ultimately, basically, the Supreme Court said that, well, yes, you probably should, but there's no practical way to do that. And then they went silent, so there was no enforcement.
They thought you should give it back to the city, not the state.
Well, it was the city who sued us. The state actually joined into the lawsuit, so we were successful in both.
Yeah, it's one thing we've even talked about at the CICD, which is doing research and trying to understand better, like dual taxation and other taxation issues. It gets very complicated. Like I said, to me, like the land tenure issues feel like an onion with layers, and you keep peeling them back. So do some of the other issues around land status, which include jurisdiction and taxation. It's why there are masters in like tribal governance and federal Indian law now, because you need one to understand, I think, the whole picture. So no, thank you, Charles. I think we will now pass the mic to Dale, and she described this housing subdivision and that tower a little bit earlier, but I also wanted to just do a quick spotlight that Macaw was also a early case study at the Center for Community Planning. So we were highlighting they have great residential planning, community development, and I was wondering, and at the time when we did the case study, I'm not sure, I think you had HEARTH at least early enacted in 2015, but I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more, Dale, to kind of HEARTH's role in your tribe or your nation's kind of economic development and community development. And then you can talk to the slide too about what we're looking at.
When we got the HEARTH Act, it makes it a lot easier to negotiate all of the business leases, because you do not have to have an appraisal. You can do a percentage and just negotiate what you want to get. And if you want to do an appraisal, you can go ahead and do it, but you can get your own appraiser too. I've also included in the HEARTH Act the WHEEL, the wind energy evaluation leases, and the WSR wind and or solar resource. That's just for in the future, so we don't have to go back and reinvent the wheel if we do get some of those. And we did have the Sail River Heights prior to the HEARTH Act, but now that we have the HEARTH Act, getting the mortgages for the individuals is a lot faster. And we do have TAMs this year. We can get the certified TSRs faster. I'm learning to input the leases, the negotiated sales, the gift conveyances, the partitions, the right-of-ways. Once you get that down, and I usually have Bodie Shaw from the regional office that will approve my work. We're working out all the things. We don't have a scanner. We only have laptop because we are remote. And so we're working on that portion of it too. So once we get everything done and the scanner and someone to approve all the time, then it really will go faster. And it's all in the system, and then it will be on the TSRs when you need it to get to the lenders for the mortgages. And the tower we have, it makes it a lot easier to negotiate the sales, and we have mostly tribal land. We only had 373 allotments and some village allotments. And so we do have, it makes it a lot easier to do the negotiations for any of our business leases that are coming in.
So we've talked about a lot of the things that Hearth is doing. Our next kind of conversation before we part today will be kind of around what some of the challenges are, right? And so, but before we kind of move on to that discussion, did anyone have any questions for Dale about Makah's experience?
No, I can add to the issue with the scanning is I think that's a lot of the stop that a lot of tribes are running into is that because we're off-site and we don't have a direct connection with a bureau agency or regional office, we're unable to scan or sometimes print from the BIA system. So even though we have 2 on-site TAM users, and within TAMS itself, you need somebody to encode and approve. So I would encourage you guys to maybe pursue another TAMS user so you can have that approval come in-house rather than having the agency or regional office approve that. So we encode and approved on-site, but under Hearth, it doesn't allow you to record. That would be LTRO functions. So we're not able to record our documents. We still have to send those to LTRO to record. But in order to record within TAMS, you need scanning capabilities. And it's like, everyone has a scanner here. I don't see what the big deal is, but the way the bureau system is set up, they have a special licenses and special scanner that needs to be approved to go into their system. So I think that's a lot of, I don't know if there's any BIA people out there right now listening, but that's an issue that a lot of tribes are having is because our offsite, some of us have VPN type connections, we are not able to scan these already approved documents into TAM, so we're not able to actually complete the approval in order for LTRO to go ahead and move forward with that recording to get that on the certified TSR. So even though we have Hearth, and this goes on to your question about the problem, is we're still subject to federal regs in regards to getting it scanned in and getting it recorded with LTRO. So I know other tribes have contracted that ability. I'm not sure on their proximity to the agency or to a regional office, but those tribes definitely have an advantage of having support like literally across the street or sometimes even in the same building. If you have an agency line or a federal line, these T-line, I know we want to keep talking about Morongo because they were kind of the pioneers for a lot of us, the blueprint for what we did. They went ahead and set up like a T-line directly to the agency that, enables them to scan, which is more of an expensive route. But that's one of the problems that we've ran into is just scanning into TAMS, these approved leases. No, and I think one of the reasons we haven't is because of that scanning issue. Like, why would we take on the LTRO functions if we can't even scan into the system in which we're recording and doing our approving into, in TAMS?
Yeah, we are lucky that our Northwest Regional Office is very fast, especially coming to mortgages, getting everything turned around and back to us, in a real timely manner. So that really helps.
We have just compacted LTRO. We just got approval a few days ago, late last week, and and so 2 of the guys that are here at the conference with me, starting Monday, our agency is about 120 miles from where our offices are, and starting Monday they will go to the agency and they will work there for 12 weeks. Shadowing everyone in their LTR office. And then as a part of the negotiated deal, then the Bureau will provide us with the computers, the scanner equipment, et cetera, to make that work. So.
That's not how that goes.
Yeah, So again, it does kind of underscore, again, having kind of the other capacity in place. So in thinking about that, we're coming to, maybe the part where we talk about some of the other challenges too, but did people have other questions about kind of right, like the recording is still happening elsewhere, right? Either BIA or if your tribe has contracted or compacted. I'm still trying to learn the distinction between those two. So if somebody has a quick explanation, I'd appreciate it. But
Under contract, the simple explanation, under contracting, the Bureau sets the goals and you carry them out. Under compacting, you set your own goals and then you carry them out.
still need the approval first. BIA approval. So if you set your own, okay. Okay. So no, thank you. But I thought also before we jump into more of some of the limitations, I was thinking if it might be good just to also talk about any other kind of misinformation or misconceptions, maybe about what HEARTH and what HEARTH can do, what it can't do. We've heard some from the panelists. I think the big one is that it, right, is for tribal trust land and restricted lands, not fee, not individual trust, not allotments. Are there any others, either in the room or on the panel, kind of maybe misperceptions of HEARTH and what it can and can't do? Okay, so nothing like maybe you thought, I thought it would do this, and then in reality, once we went through the process, it wasn't the case. That's good. We don't always like surprises, right? So I was wondering to the top two bullet points, funding for implementation and resources, right, for establishing it. I know I've kind of kept unearthing the questions around like, what did it take? What was the learning curve? What did it take to train? I just want to open it up, like if someone in their experience could answer like just a ballpark of what the financial costs were to implement, what the administrative kind of capacity costs were, and then where did those resources come from? If not from BIA, was it from the tribe? Just opening that up too for a discussion. It's like hot potato.
Well, we did have lease specialists in-house, and we were already doing leases prior to HEARTH. We did have a legislative council work on drafting our HEARTH leases. So it did take time and back and forth between our development committee and full legislature to eventually pass that law. But as far as the cost, I mean, it's the biggest thing on our side is the environmental review process. You have to explain how you're going to handle that in-house, or if you're going to continue to let the BIA do that. The BIA, when they approve these leases, and it's a federal, because they're a federal agency, it's subject to NEPA, and you might have Section 106 come into play. But if it's a tribe and not a federal agency that's approving it, and you're approving it under your HEARTH, you're subject to your own environmental review process that you spelled out in your HEARTH code. So we have our own internal environmental review process. A lot of our properties that we put homes on or do residential leases for had recently were put into trust within the last 5 to 10 years. So if it was a recently put into trust property, usually you got that environmental assessment from the fee to trust packet to refer to. And there is kind of a stipulation within HEARTH that kind of explains if there's already on-site land use within 5 acres or 10 acres or so for a residential area. If you got kind of like a plat or a CSM of the property, and you can refer to say, well, the residential use is already in this area within the entire property. If you're within 10 or 5 acres, you can actually use that as a categorical exclusion under your own HEARTH. But that's something you need to specify within your environmental review process that you do internally.
Again, we did almost all of this work in-house. I had mentioned earlier we have a CDFI and a CDC So the people that are running that have good financial minds. We have our own in-house counsel. Excuse me. We have our own in-house environmental people, and all of us work together really well. Excuse me. All of us work together really well. So when it came time to put this together, we were all of one mind under the leadership of the chairman. We knew where we were going, and we, worked together, either personal visits. Our offices are remotely located, so we did lots of email, lots of telephone, lots of lunches, and to put our ideas together and down on paper for the attorneys to make it work. So.
About 14 years ago, we started with a new lease because a lot of our HUD houses were being paid off, and they wanted to get a lease to fix their house up. And then the Sail River Heights was coming into effect, so we had 50-year leases. And then when the HEARTH Act came in, we were able to put them to 75 years, and it will show on the TSR, HEARTH lease, so you know exactly which ones are under the HEARTH and which ones aren't. So it's been really helpful, and it cost us our attorney fees to get the HEARTH Act into place, and then the lease that they started with, so that the lease could be done by USDA, veterans, and so we were all ready about 14 years ago with a good lease, residential lease.
And are you able to ballpark that cost at all via attorney fees? Because we hear that the cost is really prohibitive, and there's many inquiring minds, my own, that are like, what are the financial costs, right? Especially if there's not necessarily BIA funding for the implementation. Could you share that? If you don't feel comfortable, it's okay, but couple $100,000. If you were ballparking the financial costs in just like one figure, like Jeopardy, what is?
All of this was done in time, so this would just be as a matter of staff time and staff hours, and I think probably a couple $100,000 is probably a pretty good number to fit to that. That's staff time that was taken away from other projects and devoted to this. There's one other point, very important point on the HEARTH Act that you need to understand, and that is when everybody who has approval authority, basically that's your tribe, approves the HEARTH Act lease and everyone has signed off, the Bureau then does not approve that lease. All they do is record it so that it shows up as an encumbrance on the property. But they do not have approval authority on it. They don't approve it. The tribe does it. And that kind of be scary.
Yeah, I think that, and I don't know if we're getting to that question, why other tribes haven't kind of. Okay.
I know really quick there's about 10 minutes, so if you could, I think the conference folks would like you to fill out the evals and you can leave them face down, but yeah, why other tribes haven't adopted HEARTH funding, I heard, is a big part of it, but.
From my point of view, it's a change. I mean, tribes have been leasing their properties. It's a way to allow use of their properties without conveying title. So it's a good workaround for actually giving unrestricted use of your property. It's a way to, and it's a temporary use. It might be a long-term use, but it's not perpetual. And I think a lot of tribes have grown accustomed to the leasing process. They are used to sending the leases to the Bureau for approval. They're used to having, Big Brother looking over saying, yeah, you're good to go. This legal description looks good. The environmental review's okay. And I think change, like Charles was saying, change is kind of scary. And when you're doing all that in-house, all you're depending on is yourself. And trust me, when you're encoding those leases into TAMs, it's kind of scary because some of those, and that's like a federal database that, you can't just go back and say, I want to change this after it's approved. It's not that easy. It's pretty much set into stone once it gets approved into TAM. So if you got an incorrect legal description and that type of stuff, BIA does do some quality assurance after the fact when they're recording, but it's not always caught. That's just something to consider, and it is kind of, I'll say that Hearth isn't probably for every tribe out there. You have to have the staff and the mechanisms in place on site, leadership on board, and the right mindset going in, knowing that this is a process that the nation wants to take on ourselves. We feel that, like I said again, we shouldn't have to ask permission from the feds to use our own lands for our own uses that we seem fit. So I think that's one of the big takeaways.
You said this pertains to tribal trust lands, but not tribal member health allotments, is that correct?
Correct. The allotments would still be approved under 162.
Kind of an overarching question, maybe it's a rhetorical question. But if you're sitting in front of the Secretary of the Department of Interior tomorrow, what are you going to ask them, or what do you want them to do for you? I'm just seeing some underlying issues here, and I have that opportunity coming up again, and I want to just tell them, you got one question to ask them, what is it?
Let them, that's a very big question. So you're saying if you had like the Secretary of the Interior's ear, right? Sitting in front of you, what's the ask, what's the issue? The CICD recently did sit down with the Assistant Secretary, Tara Sweeney, and we were talking about a lot of the issues we're talking about here. So part of it is internal process needs to support all of this, right? So the BIA, I think what we've heard here from tribes is needs to put the resources and the funding, and this is not me speaking for the Minneapolis Fed, right, making a mandate for the BIA, but we've heard that that's needed. So if Hearth is important and all this time was spent in implementing it and putting it together, then where are the resources supporting it, and then also the training? So that is something, it's very general, that we've heard as an ask. And the other would be the other side of the process, right? The LTRO side, that the BIA also supports that with their internal processes so that there's standard implementation across their 80 plus offices.
What about the time it takes to process?
So the time,
Like a major problem here, it takes years.
yes, so that's part of the underlying issue, right? When we say what are the significant challenges to any development, it's the delay in processing times. So one thing that we have kind of worked on with the BIA, and this is very, very preliminary, but we're talking with them about, is there a way to somehow capture and document those processing times, right? How long it takes. Because we'll hear anecdotes where, oh, it only takes 60 days, which again, 60 days is still longer than anywhere else in the country, right? So it should be the same in Indian country. And then we hear other instances where it takes 2 years, 3 years. Those are farther and few between, but those would, I think, be the big ask. And those are very internal to the BIA in terms of what we would need from them. Yeah, we meaning Indian country, yeah. Did anyone else have a?
I have a question for Matt. How did you get in-house approval for approving your reporting?
So there's two questions, but I think Dale has one too.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay.
Well, from what I understand, one of the TAM's users can get approval authority as long as you're trained up on TAMs and have that training on how to approve and how to encode. The Bureau should give you access to that. Like, you might be able to approve right now, but you're the encoder, you said, so you're the one encoding. You can't approve your own document that you encode, but if you have another.
Specialist gets on cams, like she can encode and I can approve.
Yes, that's something that we do in-house. Is I have somebody our lease specialist encode, and I go in and approve after she encodes it, and I'm the one putting in the approval date, the approval individual, and the only thing that's shipped off to the BIA is the original lease document to record.
I know we just have 1 minute, but we have Just 1 minute, but I would like to hear from Charles, maybe an answer to his question. I think you had.
The gentleman that has the meeting with the Secretary of Interior to ask one question, and of course, keep in mind that I come from an economic development-oriented organization, and I would say that they need to push for seed programs, including some grants to help tribes get HEARTH Act put in place, and then some loans in the form of seed money to get businesses going under that HEARTH Act.
I think something that I would stress is infrastructure. Is we can have the right to lease any property we want right now, but our properties, we're in rural areas that sometimes don't have access to the most high-speed broadband. We're still trying to get natural gas to some of our areas. We need to put in electrical lines and roads and water and sewer. And I know we have IHS and roads helping us with that, but I think we need to invest getting the infrastructure out to our properties. We don't have the authority. HEARTH does not give you authority to approve right-of-ways. So that we could only lease our properties. I can put the hugest building on one of our trust properties, but unless you can get the lines and infrastructure to that, and we can invest in our communities and ourselves, that we're still having to go through the BIA for that. I think that CFR is 169 for right-of-ways. So I would like to see a right-of-ways HEARTH. So it's not just leasing that we can approve, but we can also approve our own right-of-ways on trust property. And, that would just allow us to do everything in-house, because right now we're still having to go to the BIA to put in electricity to support these lease site properties. So we're still having federal oversight, even though we're all here praising HEARTH, telling you, oh, go get HEARTH, go get TAMs, but we're still subject to federal supervision. So I would just express our investing in infrastructure in Indian country and tribes, specifically the rural tribes that are next to metropolitan areas like we are right now.
Fine, Ray, you can't even get fresh food to the schools. It's so far and remote. How do you get groceries? You got a supermarket there. What you were talking about before. Where do you get your produce from? Just the local farming area there, or how do you?
No, we tie into the same supply and distribution systems that all the grocery stores in the state provide.
So that could be a whole nother session on like food sovereignty. No, it's okay. And aeroponic, hydroponic farming, and or indoor organic farming. That's an exciting topic too. But I just wanted to say, Chimagwich, thank you for everyone that came to the session. We do have contact information here, especially for the three nations that shared their examples. If you wanted to follow up with them, otherwise, Chimagwich again to the panel. And this was great, and now you're all famous because it's been recorded. Just kidding. I think they focused just on the panel. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.